For anything that we want to talk about. And by the time I finish today, you'll think I've been wandering in the wilderness of lack of knowledge for about 40 years. So just again, bear with us as we get into this, because this is not as clear-cut an issue or a telling of biblical story as one might think. It's complicated, and I'll explain later why it is complicated. So it is going to look like I'm wandering through things today and jumping from one place to the other. Give us a couple of weeks. We'll calm down and get much more focused, because we really want the bulk of the class to be on the world history around the time of the divided kingdom and kings there. So I'm good with audio. Okay. So that's where we're going. That's where the meat of the class is going to be. It's going to take us a couple of weeks to work into that. So be patient and please come back. The other thing that I've already learned, in addition to all the newness of this, is that you don't give your co-teacher the ability to outline the course that you've talked in depth with each other about. I'm going to cover about 2,000 years worth of history. I noticed that his lessons cover about 40, 50 years apiece. So that'll be a little bit different too. So what is the aim of this class or this discussion that we're about to have here for a period of time? Well, maybe it's just me and the fact that I grew up in a really rural county that had a lot of churches but didn't have a lot of intellectual knowledge about depth of biblical history and that sort of thing. And that's not a knock. It's just a statement of fact. All of us, remember we used to do these slide things on sheets? Remember, how many of you went to a congregation where the preacher put up painted sheets on? Only two? Okay, come on, folks. Now, we're in church. We've got to be truthful here. So, but I just didn't grasp the things that I needed to grasp so that I get a full understanding of biblical history and how the history of the world impacted the decisions that were made by the Israelites and made by God trying to get the Israelites to live and honor Him better. In the fall of 1966, I went to a place larger than I grew up in, and that was the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And one of the first quarters then, one of the first courses I took that first quarter was in Ayers Hall called, what do you think it was? The History of Western Civilization. I thought, what a useless course for somebody that's going into a medical field. I don't need to, there were Romans and there's a lot of history out there, but I'm living for today and tomorrow. And I made it through the course, but I think it was because the professor was generous. But in the 60 or so years since that time, I've really become intrigued with the history around the biblical times. And I'm just getting into it. I'm not a scholar at all about it, so I'll say a lot of things that are wrong, so feel free to correct me. But it's just interesting. And one of the things that I learned from Marlon Conley, among many things, was context is important. Context is important. If you want to understand why people do things at the moment in time that they have to make a decision or take an action, you need to understand the context in which they're living, in which the question arises, in which the challenge arises. It's important what's going on around that individual or that country. And we can see this in all of today's world events. If you want to talk about, just pick a world event. Let's talk about what Merle was talking about at the end of service today. You have to understand the context of all of that around that geographic region, around the history of the people, around what led them to this particular point and why there's such depth of animosity between people or countries, just like we saw during the time of Israel, the whole history of Israel. And so context is important. And so we're going to take a little bit of time to wade into that context and get to the divided kingdom and the kings, which I think is really interesting in terms of how they made decisions and everything. So that's kind of the scope of our discussion. I really want you to participate in this. Now, oh good, it shows up a little better than back here. So we're familiar with this today, aren't we? There's not a day that goes by that we don't see something or hear something about this region of the world, is it? We think we know a lot of things about this area. And truly, we may do that. For example, we know a lot about Iran. We should know even more about this area of Iraq, which we don't talk about a whole lot anymore, but for a period of time, we talked about Iraq a lot. We talked mostly about this little piece of land here, this little sliver of land called Israel, and the bank that actually belongs to Jordan that's occupied by the country of Israel at this point. But think about all the things that have happened in the history of the world that actually come from a landmass that generously goes down about here and then over in this direction, and that's about the world. Everything else that's happened in the world comes out of this particular area. Now, this is really why I say that, because this is the same map worded in different language, worded in the language of the Bible. For example, here's Nineveh. Did we just hear a lesson about Nineveh? Yeah, Nineveh. So Jonah had to travel a lot, didn't he, to get to any water port. Do we know anything about What do we know? Abraham, birthplace of Abraham and the home place of his ancestors. What is this area called? It's a little lighter green. It's supposed to be a little darker green, but this little upside down U-shaped area, what's that called? But it's in Mesopotamia. That's correct. It's the Fertile Crescent. Is a Fertile Crescent referred to in the Bible? Yeah. This is where we get our beginnings of agriculture and things of that nature is from the Fertile Crescent. And why was that? Because this is the origin in this area, is the origin of the Tigris and the Euphrates River that we know of, that we can find, and two other rivers that are mentioned in the creation evidence in the Bible that we can't find. There were two more rivers named, weren't there? 4 rivers in all formed the Garden of Eden, right? Well, these are 2 of them. This is the Tigris, this is the Euphrates, and the Tigris rivers that flow out of here. So there's world history. The world started in this area somewhere. Now, you're going to say, where's the Garden of Eden then on this map? Well, mankind, one, doesn't need to know, and secondly, we're not smart enough to figure it out. One of the things I want to caution all of us about is when I think about world history beside biblical history, they ought to match up, shouldn't they? If something's mentioned in the Bible, it ought to perfectly match something that's happened in world history. Well, that doesn't happen, and that's why we're not going to use a lot of specific dates and tie things to specific people, because there's a lot of confusion, especially in the first 2,000 years of the history of the world, biblically or in world history. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But I'll get into it later. But know that this is the Persian Gulf. Have any of you ever been on the Persian Gulf before? Some of you. I've had the privilege of being the sickest I've ever been in my life. Right down here, just below Kuwait, which is right here. I was a guest of the Saudi Arabian government in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia and had dinner with the prince, who was also the health minister there, and ate goat cheese and marinated grape leaves. Let me tell you, if you ever go to Saudi Arabia, don't eat grape leaves marinated and with goat cheese. I've never been so sick in my life, but it's a beautiful area. The Persian Gulf is a beautiful area, and this is all desert. This is all Saudi Arabia today, as you saw earlier. And another thing to note, when we talk about Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, where do you think Upper Egypt is? Okay, I'm getting some good signs down. Upper Egypt is down here. Why is it called Upper Egypt? Higher elevation. Source of the Nile River. And the mountains and everything flows down to Lower Egypt. And that will become important as we talk about things during this course. So I'm trying to set some things in your mind about where things are, how they relate to each other. And one other thing is this area right along here has a mountain range in it that kind of divides modern-day Iran from Iraq and the other parts of the Middle East. So that was a natural barrier, and everything east of here was called Asia. And you'll see that some of the people that interacted with the Israelites and took them into bondages several times come from this area. They certainly were the reason that Babylonia and Assyria and the Amorites and later on the Hittites were in war with each other, was defending the people coming across the mountains here to take this landmass and enjoy the fruits of this fertile crescent here. Well, that's a lot of background stuff, but again, in context, if we're going to talk about these areas, we kind of need to know where they are, don't we? We kind of need to get the feel, because these places are still around today. In fact, Aleppo is still a thriving modern city in the country of Turkey. This area here became about like that. That is modern day Turkey, as you saw on the previous slide. And Aleppo is a very strong city in the southeastern part of Turkey. So if we're going to talk about things today, we need to talk about things from yesterday as well. Prior to the time of Judges, and that's what we really need to get down to, from creation to the time of Judges, and the time of Judges in the Bible started about when? About 1400 BC. Tommy will pick it up next week at that point in time and make all the confusion I've created today a little bit more clear, because he's just going to talk about a 350-year span, plus or minus a few decades, and talk about the history of the judges and the world that was around those judges as they made their decision. So prior to the time of Judges, though, definitive dates of occurrences is not very accurate. The Bible just doesn't tell us a lot about this time period from creation to the time of Judges. There's a lot of small references, a lot of small amounts of history, but no real depth. Well, you say, well, then you said, Roger, we're going to talk about non-biblical history, and we are. But non-biblical history during this time in the creation, from creation of the world to the time of Judges, 1400 BC or so, was just like the news is today in this country and other countries around the world. It was manipulated for the purposes of the people who were in power at that time. Now, some of you may say, that's an awfully strong statement to make, both about today and about yesterday. But the fact is, some of the lineages, particularly in the Egyptian historical lineage, is off by hundreds, maybe even 1,000 plus years, because the comprehensive history of the lineage of the Egyptians was written by a guy who was thousands of years, over 1,000 years removed from its occurrence. And his purpose was not to define history and give dates to specific things, but rather to justify how today's king, Pharaoh, got to be the chosen person to lead the country of Egypt. So some of the dates were mismatched with the wrong people. Some of the dates were, some of the events were made up. Some of the real events were left out. And so I will tell you that if you can make sense of the timeline prior to about the year 2000 BC, I want to sit down with you and have a really in-depth conversation, because you can pick up this one reference source, and some of you have already asked me what the reference source for this course is. Well, we don't have one. We don't have one. We've got about 15, and none of them agree on the timeline. So we're not going to talk, we're going to talk more about events rather than specific dates tied to specific people, even those that may be mentioned in the Bible. So that's why I say it's misleading and inaccurate. It's simply sufficient to know that we had that certain events occurred that led to certain decisions that impacted the nation of Israel, as well as the rest of the known world at the time. So I apologize for that. I know that's really small, but the purpose of this slide is to say that what happened in this time period, and we can't even get people to agree on when the flood occurred. Probably around the mid-2500s BC. But there's contested dates around that. But prior to the flood wiping out every human being, every animal, except those that were on the ark, the world developed into a pretty sophisticated place. And I'm not sure that I had that understanding. That I kind of thought like God created the world, and it was just kind of, people just kind of wandered around, the hunters, the gatherers, and that sort of thing. They wandered around, and then all of a sudden God blessed Israel, and then science and knowledge and everything created and came out of that. Well, that's not the way that it happened at all. If we believe evidence and some history that we can put some faith, worldly history that we can put some faith in. From the time of creation and from Cain's, from Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden, and from Cain killing Abel and Cain going out into the world, first of all, to populate that large of an area was a miraculous thing, wasn't it? It may have been hundreds or thousands of years, but in essence, Adam and Eve populated the whole world so that these countries that we just looked at were occupied by people. That's a lot of people, even in a couple of thousand years, isn't it? And so there is an aspect that Cain and his family, and it's talked about more in biblical and secular history, that some of these pieces of knowledge and advancement came from Cain and his lineage, and were adopted by Seth and others as the world expanded over this area, relatively small area, but pretty large geographically, during this, from creation to, let's say, to 2000 BC. We know that from evidence, if we can trust anything in science, and I know sometimes that's a little questionable, like this audio visual is supposed to work when you press this button up here, and it doesn't always do that, does it? Sorry, Jay. But we do have a lot of evidence that during this time period, the first 2,000 years, that there was a rather sophisticated, knowledgeable, from a science standpoint, from a geography standpoint, from a worldview of mankind. We know that because of some of these things that we found and carbon dated, and they do go back thousands of years, and that's fairly reliable before the time of the flood. Musical instruments were developed. Axes and stone tools were used during that time period. Those are advances, aren't they? Sheep were domesticated. They weren't wild animals. They were domesticated. They were brought into the kind of the flocks that we know after the flood. Fortifications were built around cities. There was defensive technology, if you will, at the time. It may have been mud walls 30 feet thick and 50 feet high, but there was a knowledge there about building things and knowing that the base had to be wider than the top for it to stand for a long time. Copper was refined and used to cast for idols and things of that nature. Agriculture began to grow. Grapes and olives were cultivated systematically and used for food sources and other things. So boats and chariots were designed during this particular time, prior to the flood. So we have a lot of evidence that mankind in the secular world was very knowledgeable about how to exist. But they also were very knowledgeable about evil, weren't they? They're very knowledgeable about evil. And isn't that why God sent the flood? Was to cleanse the earth of the evil and to say to mankind, you cannot live like this. I find one family that I'm going to save to repopulate the world. I mean, so we're starting all over again. Instead of starting with 2 people, we're starting with, 8 people? To repopulate the world. And wherever Mount Arad is in Turkey, which is up in this mountain range somewhere, probably up here as best we can tell. But this is the way the world was divided after the flood. Ham, one of the sons of Noah, had Egypt, most of North Africa, Ethiopia, things that were south of here. Shem had the Arabian desert, where we think of being the Middle East today. And Japheth had this pink area up here. Again, they had the challenge of repopulating the earth, didn't they? I mean, that's no small task, is it? But it didn't take them very long. I think that's kind of the astonishing thing. It may have taken a few hundred years, but to repopulate the earth to the extent that we see in biblical history is pretty miraculous. The thing I think that we also need to point out that helps us to understand this area today, and certainly in the time of the Israelites, is that people did not get along. I know that shocks you. I know that's brand new news to you, but they did not get along. And so, not necessarily, we don't have a lot on how these 3 brothers got along, but the fact that they nested in different areas of the world and kind of had their own fiefdoms, if you will, tells us that there wasn't a lot of exchange. But later on, there was, because they had to intermarry between families and to repopulate the world. So understanding that conflict has always been there since the beginning of time. And I think a lot of people today lose sight of the creation and biblical history of conflict in this area to help explain things that are happening today. Does that make sense? Things that are happening today just don't happen in a vacuum because something happened this way today in the last 24 hours. There's a lot of history behind the feelings among people in this particular region. A lot of history in our history as America, isn't there? Divisions, groupings, hatred, those kinds of things. You have to understand the context. Well, repopulation of the earth over several hundred years. During this time now, the time that leads down to us today, civilizations became prominent. particularly in Mesopotamia, and if we go back, this area here would be Mesopotamia, and in Egypt. Those were the two primary civilizations, but they were not the only civilizations around at that time. There were others, but those were the two dominant ones that interplayed with the Israelite people the most, at least in the very beginning. Mesopotamia means between the rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, so it was well named. It does have a fairly well agreed upon and established timeline for its rulers after the flood. After the flood. And if you want to date the flood at around 2500 BC, then that's kind of the time frame that we're talking about. And then, does anybody know when Abraham was born? I'm just taking a break. Most people agree it was around 2000 BC, about 500 years. We're talking in this 500-year span. So we're well before the time that we really think about the history of the Israelite nation in many regards, aren't we? Egypt, timeline, I've talked about that. It's full of errors and human need to justify power among the pharaohs in the lineage, because the succession process was extremely important, because they all saw themselves as gods, and they were blessed by a God, and they needed that lineage to prove their heritage and the legitimacy to the throne. Mesopotamia was originally known as Sumer, or the Sumerians. We know that a lot of the old country of Sumer was in modern-day Iraq. In fact, a lot of biblical history resides in the country of Iraq today. The Sumerians gave the world the earliest and most extensive law code. That is, someone saw, Armani, really I have Hammurabi's code up here because he gets the most credit, but that came about 200 years later. In the very beginning of organization of civilization and countries, Armani actually wrote a legal code for the discipline of individuals, including punishment, although Hammurabi's code was much more specific. 282 laws in the Hammurabi code that said, do this, don't do this, well before the time of God giving the Ten Commandments to Moses. I'm not making a connection between the two because I don't believe one influenced the other. I'm just saying that mankind had a set of rules to live by that may look very similar to the Ten Commandments. There are some people who want to tie the two together. In fact, those two and several others together to say that, hey, the Bible's not as accurate as it ought to be. The Bible is not as God-given as it ought to be. They really borrowed from legend and myth of the Sumerians. The Sumerians have a story, Gilgamesh, about the flood and how the flood came about in myth because of a war between two gods. The world was flooded, and he's the one that survived. So you have to be really careful about reading secular history and laying it beside biblical history. I think our faith says that we know what the truth is, but you can see how people get confused about the history of the world and how it relates to what was happening in the Bible. In addition to the extensive law code, they also formed or created the first form of writing. Cuneiform writing was developed by the Sumerians, which is extremely important. And we get some of this information from the cylinders that they did in cuneiform writing that gives the history of some of these individuals. Hammurabi's code, or money code, influence greatly related to trade routes connecting Syria, Canaan, Egypt, and Turkey. And this is really the comprehensive single factor that influenced world history the most against that of the Israelite nation and the stories that we see in the Bible. Trade drove all of that. People had, for example, Mesopotamia was not a very rich country of its own resources. They could barely survive out of their own resources. But they became extremely wealthy because trade routes, and then they could trade with people in Turkey, they could trade with people in Egypt, they could trade with people in the Far East. And so they became extremely wealthy because all of those trade routes came through an area in the northern part of Mesopotamia around the Aleppo area and things that we looked at a little bit earlier. Significantly for us, the Sumerians developed the concept of irrigation. Irrigation. Down in the area of the Chaldeans, Ur of Chaldea, where Abraham was from, those were the areas that were first irrigated because of the flow of water. And that we know what irrigation means to us in this country today. We know what it meant to countries in the Middle East where rainfall is even more scarce. So there's a lot of scientific advancement of mankind during this first couple of thousand years that brings us down to the time of the Judges. Well, what is this? It's a really poor it's a really good drawing, but it's a poor slide. This is called a ziggurat. The ziggurat is a temple in the Mesopotamian religion of the day. Now, I don't know about you, but I always thought that the Tower of Babel, which was in Mesopotamia, one of the first signs that they were a world power, was a cylinder shaped, broad at the base, narrowing at the top. And that's probably not an accurate kind of portrayal. Could be, but it's probably not, because ziggurats were the temples to the gods of the Sumerians. And they generally were maybe a couple of 100 feet tall. And they had these extensive stairways. Most of them had a 100-step stairway that the priest to that god, whoever this was built to honor, would go up at intervals up these 100 steps and into a very small upper chamber at the top and offer sacrifices and give thanks to that god for their existence and for their success and for their wealth. This may very well be a style that the Tower of Babel was built upon. Not being a round like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, not a round kind of thing, but something more like a platform. Platforms were really popular in those days. We see in Egypt during this time, individuals being buried, kings being buried, not in pyramids, but in a kind of a cut-off temple like this that had a flat top, a broad base, a flat top, and the burials occurred down below that in chambers down below. Well, it became too easy for people to rob those chambers below this foundation top. And so then they started building pyramids up to cover it more and built tunnels inside the pyramid. So, here's some exchange of knowledge and learning that was existing between Mesopotamia, Egypt, and through the land of Israel at this time. This is an actual ziggurat in pretty close to Ur of Chaldees in Iraq today, in southern Iraq today. In fact, Saddam Hussein was going to, it's a great temptation to put this laser on that. Saddam Hussein was going to refurbish this completely. Obviously, he ran out of time before he got that done. But this one is still in existence. This is the major part of one of those temples of worship in the Sumerian Mesopotamian religious history. Now, most of these were less than 200 feet, so they had a real lack of knowledge of how high the sky was, didn't they? Because the intent of the Tower of Babel was to build up to the sky, wasn't it? Let me stop here for a second also and say, in some histories that you read, the secular histories, they will give the secular history of Egypt into the 3000 plus BC era. And they will say that the pyramids were built prior to that time, certainly maybe between 3000 BC and 2500 BC. Well, if that was the case, the pyramids would have had to have been underwater, wouldn't it? If you accept the date of 2540 or whatever date around that time that you want to pick, the pyramids would have had to have been underwater, wouldn't they? Could they have survived the Great Flood? Probably not. And there's also historical evidence that there are fossils, sea fossils, in the stones that form the formation of the pyramids, which says that they were built after the Great Flood. So see, there's that inconsistency. And my mind is so simple, I can't reconcile those two when I read this source and it says it was built before the flood, and then I come over here to validate that, and they say, no, it was built after the flood. Well, evidence shows that probably the Egyptian history is not accurate. But I just thought this was interesting because of the Saddam Hussein connection and his interest in the history of the Sumerian people. The Sumerians invented the concept of city-state. Before this, they had been hunters, gatherers, nomads. If you ask students in school today, how did the people in the Arabian desert live? They would say on camels and traveling around from water hole to water hole. You know, they were wanderers. Well, the Sumerians developed those into city-states, small communities, small groups. But those trade routes caused the exchange of information between those small communities. And then they began to grow, and people began less to be nomads and began to live in what we would call cities these days. And then we have the establishment of the old Babylonian Empire. Not the one that was so prominent during the time that Tommy is going to talk about, and we'll talk about later, but the very early days of the old Babylonian Empire. Another name that you hear in the Bible is the Hittites. The Hittites basically came from the area of Turkey, and later on they will be the ones that will overcome the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, and they'll take control of this whole area that we've been talking about. But that doesn't occur till around 1600 BC. And I know we're flying through a lot of this. This is the old Babylonian kingdom here. Again, this is the Persian Gulf. Tigris and Euphrates River come up through here, the Fertile Crescent. This is where the Hittites were up in far eastern Turkey. And here's little old Canaan over here on the side, a major travel route from Egypt to these areas and for people going from Asia over to the Mediterranean Sea. So there's this pollination, this exchange of knowledge and information. Just trying to get you comfortable with where we're going to spend our time a little bit. This is just another look at where the country, right here, Sumer. We know that this is a term used in the Bible for a group of people that eventually are warlike. We know that actually Akkad became the successor to Sumer, and then old Babylonia survived that. But again, These are very mountainous ranges. We think of all that Middle East being flat desert, but it's not. The Egyptians, and I think I'm about out of time. Don't applaud. We could spend 52 weeks on the Egyptians. Just suffice it to say that most of the things we know about their ability, their knowledge, and their construction ability and everything is all valid. The timing of when those things occurred is what's under question, and because we're highly suspicious that the writer, which we do not have his complete work today, his complete work of the lineage of the 30 dynasties that he identified, and some of the dynasties had multiple kings in them for the land of Egypt, does not exist anymore. We only know sections of it because historians like Josephus and others, Greek historians, would quote out of his original work some of the things they were trying to justify. So that adds to the confusion and the suspicion too. Manetho is the guy who put this together. He identified 30 dynasties that ruled Egypt. 2 more have been added by historians since then. The thing about the Egyptians is, if you read the history of Israel, some of the kings of Israel were allies of Egypt and expected Egypt to fight off the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, etc., and made pacts with them. And at other times, they were at war. They were at war with Egypt. So it's the same kind of conflict that we see today. There's no consistency in it. Sometimes they were friends with Egypt. Sometimes they were in enslavement to Egypt. Sometimes they were being murdered by Egypt. Sometimes they were living in peace and prosperity with Egypt. And I think you've had about all you can take this morning for the look on your face. I appreciate you saying through that. I know this has been rough, but again, look at context. Look at context. And let's see where we are as we move on. Tommy will pick up with the latter part of this next week and talk about the judges if you want to look ahead and read ahead a little bit. But he's going to look at it from the secular view of the judges of Israel. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. No. That's just too much material.
I told her I was working on my proof, and I told her, I said, I finished. I said, I've got all my notes for my class. I said, 25 pages.